This is about the ancient flood tablet from the University of Pennsylvania. And in fact, this image that you have in screen one is to the credit. It goes to the Babylonian Section of the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. Almost 6 years ago, I had the privilege of having lunch with Dr. Philip Jones, listed currently as, quote, Associate Curator and Keeper of Collections in the Pennsylvania Museum's Babylonian Section. He showed me many tablets, including one possibly related to Noah's flood. He kindly took a picture of me holding it in my hand. Further down is a much clearer picture of the tablet. You've already seen it once, but you'll see it again, hopefully, without my fingers holding it. Now, why should we be interested? It's because truth is important, the Bible is important, artifacts from biblical times deserve scrutiny, and our future is important. Let me introduce two men, Dr. Archibald H. Sayce. He was once Oxford Professor of Assyriology, and Dr. Hermann Hilprecht, once University of Pennsylvania Professor of Assyriology. Both of these men go back a century and more. And Dr. Sayce's 1903 book, The Religions of Ancient Egypt and Babylonia, explicitly refers to Dr. Hilprecht. They were lectures given in 1903 by him, and there's a picture of Dr. Sayce. On page 255 and 6 we read, and this is Sayce writing, the British Museum, moreover, is no longer the sole repository of Babylonian literature. The Louvre, the Berlin Museum, and the American University of Pennsylvania are equally filled with the clay tablets of the Babylonian scribe. The Americans are continuing their excavations at Nippur, where, ever since 1888, they have been excavating for the first time on a thoroughly systematic and scientific plan. And so far as they have been examined by Professor Hilprecht, and there's his name explicitly, it would appear that they relate to all the various branches of knowledge which were known and studied at the time. For his part, Dr. Hilprecht wrote, you see the booklet on the lower right there, the earliest version of the Babylonian Deluge Story and the Temple Library of Nippur. It was published by the University of Pennsylvania in 1910. With a PhD from Leipzig, he wrote, quote, the cuneiform fragment, the one held in my hands, submitted in the following pages in connection with a general survey of the character and contents of the Temple Library is based upon more recent investigation, contains the oldest account of the Babylonian Deluge Story extant. He added that, quote, it agrees with the biblical version of the flood, of the deluge, in a very remarkable manner, much more so than any other cuneiform version previously known. We must realize that the Nippur tablet was written and broken before Abraham had left his Babylonian home in Ur of the Chaldees. In his mind, it was around 2000 BC. Now, whereas he may be wrong about its predating Abraham, it certainly predates the so-called priestly account by many, many hundreds of years. Sayce himself was not a priestly enthusiast. Now that's that term priestly I put in quotes because a lot of people need to realize that there is a way of breaking up the Old Testament, supposedly in 4 parts. And you see the singers there. Instead of Moses being the author, there are actually four Moses. J for Yahwistic or Jehovistic, E for Elohistic, D for, I think, Deuteronomy, and P for the priestly. And we've already seen that word priestly. Sayce on page 444 wrote, quote, "It is not with the so-called Elohistic," there's the second man there with a white beard, "or the so-called Yahvistic," that would be J. You can spell Jehovah with a J or a Y. Yahwistic account only that the agreement exists, but with both together as they are found at present combined, or supposedly to be combined in the Hebrew text. The fact throws grave doubt on the reality of the critical analysis. Now, I appreciate Sayce's skepticism here, as the documentary hypothesis was and is seriously flawed. The current secular approach is to view Noah as fictional, more or less an invention of Jewish priests around 500 BC. Supposedly, the priests incorporated the Babylonian myth into the Bible, making the Babylonian account a prototype of the biblical one. This critical view should be rejected for many reasons. The main one being that the King of creation, Jesus Christ, referred explicitly to Noah and the global flood as literal in the Gospels. And he actually is the one who oversaw and superintended all that happened. Jesus said at one point, before Abraham was, I am. Abraham was before Moses. So certainly if he was before Abraham, he was before Moses. Now, I realize a lot of people don't agree with Jesus on that, but that doesn't mean it's wrong. Jesus was right on. Now, Dr. Irving Finkel, a curator in charge of cuneiform clay tablets at the British Museum, promoted the unbelieving approach. He authored the book, The Ark Before Noah. One can see that even the title challenges biblical chronology. How could Noah's Ark be before Noah? He built it. Finkel denies both the historicity of Noah and the view that Moses wrote about Noah many hundreds of years prior to 500 BC. Noah, who predated Moses by 1,000 years, lived thousands of years before the priestly view. So the idea of fake science, fake history, there's a lot of fake stuff going on in the world today. Now, I wrote to Dr. Finkel about this, and he responded January 13, 2014. Dear Sir, judging from your letter, you should find the book of interest, but I am afraid you will have to locate one elsewhere somehow, and so on. Best wishes, Irving Finkel. And I gave his title stuff there, which he sent. Now, I had written him, he didn't even answer questions that I wrote, and here's part of what I said. Do you place the biblical account of the flood around 500 BC? I place it closer to 1,000 years earlier, for I believe, contrary to the documentary hypothesis, there really was a man called Moses who wrote the biblical account. Additionally, there is a growing corpus of archaeological artifacts that confirms the historicity of the Old Testament. For example, Bulai, with different biblical kings and names that are mentioned in the Old Testament. A Bulai is a seal that is used to sort of seal a scroll, and you can get the impression of the person that is sealing it. And often their names are there. Hezekiah is one that is mentioned on a Bulai. And of course, Hezekiah was a biblical king in the Old Testament. Sorry, I went too far. Professor Hilprecht, and there's a picture of him down, probably, I don't know if there are any cuneiform tablets there, maybe on the tray behind him or something, the cabinet in front of him. He had written over a century ago that, quote, "It is inconceivable to an objective historian that the biblical deluge story of the so-called priestly code," and there he's quoting that documentary hypothesis idea, "agreeing with the oldest Babylonian version, which is characteristic of Nippur in so many important details, should have been received into the Old Testament at a time when Nippur's glory was long past and its temple library practically in ruins." In other words, he was saying this idea that the Old Testament, the story of Noah and whatever, came around 500 BC is ridiculous. That's basically what he's saying. I agree with him, and it seems as though Sayce agreed with him too. But that doesn't mean that it's the prevailing view today. It's the fake history is what is prevailing, it seems. 7 years prior to Hilprecht's words, Professor Sayce was more or less in agreement with what Hilprecht wrote. He had written, and you see this on page 445, that, quote, "Palestinian coloring of the biblical version of itself excludes the supposition that the story was borrowed by the Jews in the age of the Babylonian exile. Such a supposition indeed would be little in accordance with the feelings of hatred felt by the captives toward their Babylonian conquerors and the religious beliefs and traditions of the latter." Thus, long ago, we have Professors Hilprecht and Sayce, authorities in Assyriology, rejecting the documentary hypothesis view, the view currently held by Dr. Finkel. Sadly, the latter, Dr. Finkel, seems willing to walk lockstep with a failed, evolutionary, biased, unbelieving, critical theory. He was born a Jew, but apparently embraced atheism. So why should we be listening to an atheist as he examines and tries to understand the Old Testament? It is sad that some Jews reject their Torah and align with unbelieving evolutionary ideology. Hitler was an evolutionist. I do not agree with everything Sayce wrote, however. For example, on page 476, he said, "The Sabbath rest was essentially of Babylonian origin. To the contrary, it was of divine origin. God himself rested on the seventh day of creation week." My father had handwritten on the next page, and I got this book from him, quote, "In the Mosaic law, it is remember the Sabbath day," evidently from the first of creation in men's teaching, perhaps very unconscious. The Creator was a pattern for humans to follow, and the 7-day week is common in a majority of cultures today. My dad also had a doctorate in theology. On page 295, Dr. Sayce wrote this, quote, "Hebrew beliefs were derived from the civilization of the Euphrates." What? Was the deliverance of Israel from Egypt of Babylonian origin? Did Passover observance come from the Euphrates? Did Jews get the idea of circumcision from Babylon? I'm not even aware that the Babylonians back then even practiced circumcision. Returning now to affirming Sayce, he wrote, quote, "On the other side, its parallelism with the account of the deluge in the book of Genesis is at once striking and startling. The story, in fact, must have been of immemorial antiquity in Babylonia. Isros, and I don't know how to say that name, and his ship were depicted upon some of the earliest seals, and Babylonian chronology drew a sharp line of division between kings who had reigned before and after the flood. And of course, that's what was true of people living in the Bible. People lived much longer before the flood than after, and so on. Okay, let's move on. Flood accounts do indeed seem to be of immemorial antiquity, to use Sayce's word, because a major flood really happened. Of course it has antiquity. It really happened. It is understandable that Noah and his 3 sons would pass the information on to children, grandchildren, etc. Moreover, marine fossils are uncovered by the billions all over the earth in land even higher than sea level. This harmonizes with a global flood, but does the tablet I held in my hand point to this global flood or to a later localized flood associated with Ice Age melting? On October 17, 2013, I had the privilege of having lunch with Dr. Philip Jones, Associate Curator and Keeper of the Collections for the Babylonian Section of the University of Pennsylvania Museum. For the excellent images that follow, and you've already seen, he said I should credit the Babylonian Section of the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, and I've repeatedly done that, even in this video so far. But there it is again, the picture you saw at the beginning. I'm not going to read it again, but the credit does go to the Babylonian Section of the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. Not all Akkadian scholars agree with Hilprecht's dating. Theophilus Picus and Fritz Hummel, for example, advocated the late Hammurabi or early Kassite. I'm not sure how to say that. And the dates are given. E.J. Gordon dated the tablet to the Middle Babylonian period, as did Benjamin Foster. And I'm going to say a little bit about Benjamin Foster. On page 49, Dr. Hilprecht offered his translation of the dozen or so lines of the Nippur tablet, and I'm planning on giving them in this video. Now, the words that are in brackets are actually not in the cuneiform text, but Dr. Hilprecht offered them according to context, and so does Dr. Foster in some measure do this, something similar. Now, approximately 86 years after Dr. Hilprecht's publication, there is a more recent translation appearing in the book to the right, Before the Muses. And that's by Benjamin Foster. I believe he's at Yale, or was at Yale. I am taking the liberty of displaying both translations in couplet form. Dr. Hilprecht's couplet appears first, and I've emboldened his words in yellow. And I do not enumerate the lines. Apparently, Dr. Foster decided not to give anything for line 1. But Dr. Hilprecht gave the word "the." Line 2, Hilprecht says, "The confines of heaven and earth I will loosen." Dr. Foster says, "I will explain." And I try to bring those two together. The words loosen and explain may relate as one who explains may loosen understanding, whatever. I don't know if that's a good idea or not, but let's move on. There are more important lines to consider. Now, Hilprecht for line 3 says, "A deluge I will make, and it shall sweep away all men together." Foster said, "A flood will seize all the people at once." So that's similar. Hilprecht for line 4 says, "But thou seek life before the deluge cometh forth." Foster said, "Before the flood comes forth." And both those translations seem more or less equivalent to me, at least. Let's take a look at lines 5 and 6. "For over all living things, as many as there are, I will bring overthrow, destruction, annihilation." Now, Dr. Foster apparently disagrees with that line because he writes, "Good reeds, as many as there are, should be woven, should be gathered for it." Line 6, however, there does seem to be agreement between the two scholars. build a great ship, build a big boat. So those are equivalent. The two scholars agree on line 6. So the second half of the translation couplets seems equivalent, but was the original author talking about weaving or destruction? The word reeds apparently does not appear in line 5 of the tablet. 7 and 8. Total height shall be its structure. Notice what Foster. Let its structure be interwoven of good reeds. Line 8. Hilprecht. It shall be a houseboat carrying what has been saved of life. Foster. Let it be a vessel with the name guardian of life. So there's similarity there. Line 9. With a strong deck over it. Foster says both roof it over with strong covering. So that's similar. And then line 10. Hilprecht. The ship which thou shalt make. And Foster, into the boat which you will make. Couplets, both are roughly equivalent. Line 11. Now this is maybe the most significant one. Hilprecht, into it bring the beasts of the field, the birds of the heaven. Foster says, bring aboard wild creatures of the steppe, birds of heaven. And then Hilprecht, and the creeping things, two of everything instead of a number. And Foster said, heap up. This couplet, perhaps more than the others, seems to be pointing to something bigger than flooding resulting from Ice Age melting. In a large local flood, birds can fly and animals walk to other regions. Both translations of this couplet seem more or less in harmony. The Bible certainly does talk about beasts and creatures of the field, steppe, and also birds being on the ark. This account of the flood does more or less harmonize with Moses' account, and many Bible scholars today believe Moses did write his account. Such would be many hundreds of years before the imagined priestly account. It also seems likely that Moses may have had his own set of clay tablets for reference, perhaps not altogether unlike the one I held in my hand. I'm not saying that Moses had that one, but maybe something similar. I don't know. The former Penn professor wrote on page 61, unless we assume that in the earliest period of Babylonian history there existed already different versions of the deluge story in the plains of Shinar, a theory which for various reasons I must decline, it is evident that the Nippur fragment, by 1500 years earlier than the two Nineveh versions, represents the oldest version of the Babylonian deluge story in a Semitic translation. It is inconceivable to an objective historian that the biblical deluge story of the so-called priestly code, agreeing with the oldest Babylonian version, which is characteristic of Nippur in so many important details, should have been received into the Old Testament at a time when Nippur's glory was long past in its Temple Library, practically in ruins. Noah's flood, and this is the last slide. Noah's flood happened, and the Son of Man, Jesus, predicted his return would be, quote, as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark. And they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man, Matthew 24. As stated at the beginning, our future is important. Noah and his family were ready. May our families be ready. Our ark is Jesus. We must be washed in his blood and clothed in his perfect robe of righteousness, received by faith in him. Yahweh Jesus is returning, and we should be ready. We should be in him.